Al McFarlane. Welcome to The Conversation with Al McFarlane. Today is April 5th, 2023. And we are glad to be here, glad to have you along. I begin always by inviting you to support The Conversation with Al McFarlane by subscribing. You may be connecting to us right now via YouTube, the Black Press USA channel, via YouTube, the Insight News channel, or you could be connecting through our Facebook platforms and Twitter or even LinkedIn. However method you're using to be a part of this, we want you to support us, share, like, but we really are asking you to go over to the Insight YouTube channel and subscribe to the program. We're trying to grow our subscription base to about 1,000. We've crossed 300 recently, and we are picking up members every day. We'd love to have you become a member today and also share, invite your friends, your colleagues, your networks to tune into the program. What we do, we try to create a place where we can have what I call robust conversations. And it's a pleasure for me as a newsman to interview people, talk about issues and ideas that are relevant, and to bring a perspective that's unique, that's special, that comes from our experience as African Americans, as Africans in the New World, and provide commentary about everything, both locally and globally. It's our duty, it's our obligation, and it's certainly our privilege to do it. Well, yesterday was the anniversary, the 55th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, and I wanted to pay tribute to that or make reference to it because it was such a important event in the nation's history and in the world. There's a column about it online today at insightnews.com. It's by our columnist Chuck Hobbs. We published it yesterday. It starts with a picture on the screen here of the people pointing to where they thought the shooter did his work from at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. And I'll just read a couple of paragraphs out of the story. Hobbs wrote, today, April 4th, marks the 55th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And the picture below this article says they were looking at, the family looking at his mortal remains and for the final time at his sister's chapel on the campus of Spelman College. And the article says this year the memorial or the commemoration falls on Easter week, kind of providing a perfect backdrop to draw important comparisons. And I think you should go to our website, Insight News, to see the comparisons that Chuck Hobbs draws to the story of Christ and the story of MLK. Well, the second hot topic today is local, about Ramsey County in particular. And there is a report that indicates that Ramsey County is lagging behind the rest of the metro area in this new health ranking. It's an article by Tori Van Ott, and it says it's entitled, it's an analysis of health outcomes in Minnesota counties in 2023. And the short port I'll mention is that it says Ramsey County earned one of the state's lowest scores in the annual health outcomes analysis by the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute. And it said that Ramsey ranked 66th out of 87 counties for metrics such as length and quality of life. It said the rest of the 7-county metro area was in the top 50% or landing in the upper middle or highest quartiles. Carver County ended up with the state's top score, followed by Scott and Wright County. Hennepin was 37th. But Ramsey is a problem. So maybe I'll ask my guest today to sort of unpack some of that and go into it. My guest today, I'm pleased to have on the program an important conversation with Becky Timm and Dr. Zeke McKinney, representing Advocates of Better Health, Advocates for Better Health. We'll talk about that organization, what it is, what it does, and health in general. Dr. Zeke McKinney is an occupational and environmental medicine medicine physician and an advocate. Let's see, I'm reading this bio the wrong way, so pardon me for that. Listen, you both are here. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Here, I'll do the bio again. Becky Timm is the CEO of Advocates for Better Health, and she's got 25 years experience in nonprofit leadership. She leads this innovative work at Advocates for Better Health and its philanthropic arm, ABH, the foundation, and Dr. Zeke McKinney, an occupational and environmental medicine physician, and currently president of Advocates for Better Health. So I think I got that right this time. Becky and Dr. Zeke, good afternoon. Welcome to the conversation. Good to see you both.
Thanks, Al.
Well, let's go straight into 101. Let's describe the organization, its mission, Advocates for Better Health. Becky, I'll start with you.
Sure. We actually have been around in one form or another for 170 years. We are a physician-led organization. We have served at the county level for all that time. We like to say that we represent physicians at all stages of their career. For instance, we have a really great public health advocacy fellowship that pairs medical students at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and Duluth with practicing physicians who are also interested in advocacy. So they're with us 9 months, just to learn how to make their voice heard at the Capitol Power. They are just one of the best things I like about our organization. We also do physician wellness. We help with advocating at the state capitol on commercial tobacco and access to healthy foods and universal school foods. And we just like to be involved with the public health scene here in the Twin Cities and throughout the state. And we're led by a great board of directors. And our current president for the last 2 years, we've been lucky enough to be working with Dr. McKinney.
Dr. McKinney, good to see you again. Thank you for being. We'll be working together in the future as well. So thank you, and good to see you. Talk about. We jump right in this question of disparities in Minnesota. We are famous, it seems, infamous, because we've got a great health for most of Minnesota, but not so great health for Black people and brown people. And I think that one of the discussions that I want to have all the time is why that disparity exists and what is being done to eliminate access barriers to excellent health for all citizens, particularly those of us in the Black and brown communities. Dr. Zeke?
Yes, sir. Thank you again for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Al. So looking forward to this conversation. Here's the thing, I look at Minnesota a lot like Massachusetts, and I only say this in case somebody's watching from outside of Minnesota because, we're like flyover country here. But, we have great healthcare here. We have great public health here. We have great education here. However, we have some of maybe the highest, health and education and public health disparities. And so I've always wondered, why was that? Was it that, we're really doing that much better for our affluent or primarily white populations, or doing that much worse for our Black, brown, indigenous populations? And it turns out it's really more the first than the second. Our underserved populations are really not doing any worse here than anywhere else. However, our affluent or populations with privilege and access to healthcare and everything like that are doing so much better than everywhere else. And in general, when we look at these kind of disparities, people are quick to think like, oh my gosh, is it a biological thing? Are Black people more sick than white people? Mm-hmm. That's completely not true. We're all human beings. We're all the same. What these measures actually are a proxy of is what are called social determinants of health. All the things that affect us in our life that have nothing to do with, going to the doctor. Where do you live? What kind of job do you have? Do you have access to housing? Do you have access to healthcare? Do you have access to food? And so I think the data that you were referring to from this recent report really reflects more of that, simply because we know that, Ramsey and our metro area counties certainly have some of these more underserved populations than other parts of Minnesota.
Becky, what's your thought on disparities and the both almost seemingly intractable character nature? I know it's not, but that's how it appears. That's how we seem to address it. The society it seems to me, was willing to throw up its hands and say, "Oh, we can't do anything about it." What do you think?
I think that was an attitude for the state. I pride myself on being sixth generation Minnesotan, and I identify as white, and I have benefited from a number of things that Zeke has listed off: social determinants of health, access to education, access to healthcare. What I'm most passionate about is our really large nonprofit system in our state. It is one of the most robust, and I'm so glad to see over the last 25 years the change and the recognition of representation and leadership. So I see that funders are funding more organizations that are led by BIPOC leaders, that are serving communities, that are generated by that. Um, it's a real shift from how we've done business in the past, that we think that we know how communities need to be served. We maybe have misunderstandings of why certain health outcomes happen in certain communities without actually asking that community. So I'm glad that ABH, Advocates for Better Health, have a leadership structure with our board and working on projects that are community informed, as opposed to just assuming and doing the status quo, but really learning from communities, figuring out the resources, figuring out how we can be alongside community members to accomplish the goals that they set for themselves. So it's been a very challenging, and also I'm glad that there's been so many different conversations since the murder of George Floyd and the uprising. I've seen just in so many different circles that I am in that there's a real recognition that things aren't fair, and it takes all voices to recognize that and to make the changes and to have courage about that.
Well, I like that you said you are a sixth generation Minnesotan, and I'm going to dig in on that for a second. Talk about your family lineage, and how does this question, from a generational perspective, explain or look at both the growth of non-white populations and the parallel structural barriers in place, sometimes in law, sometimes in policy, that was restrictive. Covenants in housing, for example, places you could live, jobs you could have or not have. How have you observed that personally, and how do you think your family, from where you came, observed it? I raised the question because yesterday I had a brother, Mark Anderson. You might know Mark. He's active in politics and community, but I think 4 or 5 generations from, he said his dad came from, grandpa came from, I think it was Ireland or Sweden. So he told the story of being a third generation Swede, farming, then to the city, and then his generation born in the city. And he's watched the change, and there's a personal family awareness of the change. How does that show up in your family and your personal understanding of where the community and how it has evolved and where it's going?
Great question, Al, and something that I've thought about quite a bit. I volunteer and have been on the board of the Hennepin History Museum for the last 5 years. I love history, especially locally based. So my family arrived here on my mother's side in 1872 from Germany. And I once had a German tell me that I look more German than anyone else. So I'm not sure what to think about that, but that's my background. And they arrived after the Dakota War. So they settled in Southwest Minnesota when there was a bunch of free land available to farmers and to pioneers. And
Where in southern Minnesota?
In Wanda, Minnesota.
Okay.
They don't even have a stop sign, so it's pretty small. But we've had some genealogists in my family, and we have a really good record. And I just want to unpack how well my family was, how they benefited from that land, which is presumably was free or cheap, and they were able to become farmers. They were able to develop through multiple generations things that were not open to people of color. The land was taken from the Dakota and indigenous people, And if you happen to be a person of color in Minnesota, you still didn't have access to land like my pioneer family. So fast forward to my parents' generation. I'm really proud of them. They were the first ones to go to college. My dad grew up on a farm and got out by going into West Point and doing the military route to get his college education. My mom went to Mankato State and became a teacher. So they were the first in that generation to actually become get a higher degree, and their goal was to live in the suburbs after they got married. And so with a little help from the family, they got a house, and my mom still lives there today. So I could stop at that and just say, oh, my family was great. We really pulled ourselves up from bootstraps, and they allowed my two sisters and I to go to college and really have great opportunities. But that's not the whole picture. And I really hope that these conversations continue about how the system was meant for people like me. I grew up in the suburbs, and redlining wasn't part of it, and racial covenants weren't part of it because they already naturally excluded everyone else, including Jewish community members. So for the last 10 years, I worked in neighborhood associations in Minneapolis, and people who lived in the neighborhoods in the 1920s are the same people who live in the neighborhoods now, 100 years later. Not much has changed. Although we don't have official redlining and racial covenants any longer, they're just so much more unaffordable. And so when you have a family like mine who had grandparents who were able to purchase houses, some of them, not all of them, and then my parents purchased houses, and now I'm a homeowner, I think it's just important for us to know how the system was set up to allow people like me to really benefit and exclude other people.
And Zeke, how does that sound to you? I mean, I think that the story that Becky is telling is a fair representation of what life was like for most Americans. And, everybody struggled at one time or another, one way or another, right? And everybody took advantage of what they could take advantage of. But we end up telling the story in a way that sort of omits the underside of it. And Becky is addressing that at some level here. And that's the right thing to do, I think. From your point of view, as a physician, but also as an African-American, what story do you tell? And all this I'm saying to have us come back to talk about the organization Advocates for Better Health and how this informs, and creates passion for the work that the organization does. But Zeke, what do you think?
Yeah, and first of all, I think Becky did a really good job of acknowledging privilege and talking about what that looks like for white people in America. When you talk to people about this, they might say, well, wait a second, slavery was, a couple hundred years ago or even more. How could this still be a problem now? But, people seem to forget, even after the Civil War, we had Jim Crow laws that really prevented a lot of what Black people could do, both in terms of employment, housing, and a variety of other just, day-to-day life activities. And then, even in context of thinking of George Floyd's murder more recently, think back to Emmett Till. People don't realize that wasn't that long ago. My parents were kids when Emmett Till was murdered. And so that was still not even one generation ago.
Where's your family from here, right? Your Twin Cities family?
Well, no, sir. I actually moved here when I was 5. So I'm a first or 0th generation Minnesotan, though it is home to me because I came here and started first grade. But, for everybody older than me in my family, this isn't really home for them. But this is what has always been home for me. And so I feel attached to this state because I do think there are a lot of things we have going for us here. And, I think, we have seen a lot of migration of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and even other people from all over the world here in the past couple decades. And I think we have that in our favor. But again, that's what's reflected in that data you see, that these same opportunities that existed for white people to, just as Becky described, and I'm not putting that on her, to accrue housing, accrue generational wealth over, whatever, 4, 5, 6 generations. For us, that's only been maybe 1 or 2 at the most, certainly not enough. And George Floyd's murder really opened people's eyes to how stark that disparity really is, though. Even for me as a Black person, from day one as a child, people said, hey, you better watch out for the police. That's going to be serious. Dave Chappelle in his stand-up on HBO joked about that in the year 2000 and said, "Oh yeah, white people know now. You know, they read it in Newsweek." And it's like, well, no, here we are 23 years later, and it's still really just coming to the surface of people's awareness.
In regards to how connected we are, I appreciated, Becky, you're giving the story of your grandparents and the immigration story. And it always reminds me that over my shoulder is a photograph of me as a 5-year-old sitting in my uncle's house where we all lived in Kansas City. Uncle was the patriarch of the family. But this particular photograph had me and other 5, 10, 5, 8, 9-year-olds sitting on the floor in front of a divan. And on the divan, the couch, we called it, I guess, was the uncle who owned the house, holding his youngest daughter, his wife, my aunt, my mom's sister, then their mother, my grandmother, we called her Big Mama. And then next to Big Mama was her mother and her mother's sister. So the point is that her mother, Lizzie Splond Harrison, was born in 1860. And I'm talking about a photograph that was taken in 51 or 2.
Wow.
And I realized just a few years ago, the picture's been sitting there for as long as I live in this house. I've lived here in this house 40 years, almost 50 years. But a few years ago, I looked at the picture again. I said, you know what? My great grandma was born property of other human beings. And I say that to say, Zeke, that this isn't far. You mentioned Emmett Till being far. That's correct, because I knew somebody and talked to someone and was held in love by someone who, when she was born, was property of another human being. And the thought of that hurts me still, just the idea of it. But it means we have an opportunity to face all of this history and face it forward. So let's bring that back around to talking about the work of advocates for better health. What challenges in particular have you been addressing historically, and how has that changed given the change, the uprising, the civic impetus that exists now that didn't exist in the same way? What do you see changing, and how has the role of the organization changed? Start with Becky and then go to Dr. Zeke.
Zeke and I have been talking quite a bit about what makes whole health. What are the components? And we have healthcare, public health, and the community. And we've traditionally been more heavy and more representative in the healthcare area. And so as an organization, we want to expand even more into public health and into supporting the community and community-driven organizations. Another issue, and it's not quite the same, but it's something that I've been struck by with this being new to the field. I started at ABH in May. Is just the amount of stress and the amount of struggle that our healthcare workers and providers, and in our case, physicians, medical students, and residents experience. So I'm so passionate to learn more about that so that they can continue to be serving our communities. We work with an organization that helps physicians recovering from substance use disorder. We help with mental health wellness checkups with our residents. And so those are the folks that have graduated medical school and have a few more years of training until they become on their own. And we've also heard a lot about moral injury. And there was a great podcast on Point yesterday. And that to me is a new concept, and it's not being able to serve your patients the way that you had taken an oath and the way that you had committed to. So my heart is just really is touched by how deeply our physicians and our other healthcare workers feel towards their commitment to our community, to our patients. And I hope that we can live into that even more about supporting those workers. And I've learned so much from each one of our board members, I've had a chance to talk to them one-on-one and to hear their stories, and just the extraordinary commitment they have to serving our community. It's really awe-inspiring.
Jump in, Zeke. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think Becky did a really good job there. I mean, look, the good news is that I think physicians, just through the nature of their job, get to see truly how privileged we are, and to see how a lack of privilege or a lack of support for different slices of our population truly impact their health. And that's where Advocates for Better Health is trying to come in. You know, physicians are at work and are like, gosh, I could really help my patient if they had access to food, or if they had access to pay for this medication that I'm prescribing them. And so we want to try to reduce those barriers, optimally eliminate those barriers, so that physicians aren't feeling this sense of moral injury. And that concept is a new one. So it's really a change in focus from when people were talking about physicians being burnt out, which is really, you know, putting that on the individual, like, why aren't you tough enough? Why can't you deal with it? But rather really addressing the system level problems, which is, we see the issues that our patients face. And for the most part, it's not anything to do with my ability to provide care in the clinic. It's really about what happens to them when they leave the clinic and go home and, you know, participate in their community. And that's the things that we don't have a venue to address as physicians, you know, working within a health system or in our clinic. And so Advocates for Better Health is trying to provide that venue. And whether we do that through legislative advocacy, through grants, through community partnership, in any number of ways, that's what we want to lean into. And thankfully, I think we're starting to see a lot of this change, you know, at a variety of levels. You know, the Minnesota Department of Health is hiring, you know, leaders to address health equity who are physicians and who aren't white. We are, you know, obviously St. Paul has a black mayor, which is wonderful. And more, you know, again, this awareness, especially following George Floyd's murder, though it certainly was happening to some degree before, and certainly plenty after, is a part of it. And people realizing, you know what, my own privilege, and even me, Zeke McKinney, despite being black, you know, look, I have plenty of privilege too. I have a responsibility to my community to do something with that privilege and with that voice. And so us as physicians and Advocates for Better Health, we can speak on behalf of those who may not have a voice represented in society for them.
I heard a show on public radio yesterday. They interviewed, it was yesterday, a young resident. And the question was unionizing. Doctors are unionizing the residents anyway. I'm not sure what the scope of it is. Maybe you can tell me, but it was interesting. And the issues raised by the woman that was interviewing had to do with mental health for physicians, the burden, the inordinate burden, number of hours worked, you know, how you decide to have a family or not have a family. If you have to do 80 hours a week of work, what do you do for childcare? And the cost of childcare as a resident is half of your salary. And if you wanted a nanny, it would be your whole salary. And so you couldn't make ends meet. And so all these stresses are there. And the question is, how do physicians and particularly residents become better advocates for change within the organization to support their desire to do the work they're training for? What do you think about that? And how does that play into the landscape of things that you're concerned about representing and advocating for physicians?
Zeke, would you like to talk about the stressors, and then I can talk about unionization trends going on in the U.S.?
Absolutely. So, I mean, Al, you hit a lot of them on the head. Some of it's hours, some of it's money. You know, residents don't get paid very well, even though people think physicians make a lot of money, and we tend to. We're also paying off huge student loans. Resident physicians, that is physicians who are in training in their specialty, only make about 50 or 60 grand and are working like 80 or 100 hours a week. So, you know, if you do the hourly math on that, it's not getting paid very well. Right. But the additional stressors are, like you said, you know, sometimes we don't have control over when we can take a day off, or can take a sick day, or have, you know, access to childcare or control of our schedule. You know, so it's also, it hurts because we see our colleagues around us, you know, nurses, other clinical professionals who are totally unionized and are like, you know, their shift is over and they're out the door. Whereas for us, we don't really get that opportunity. And you might notice that whereas we've seen, for example, nurses go on strike, you'll never see physicians do that, because at the end of the day, to some degree, I think we see ourselves as sort of the last line of defense, and it wouldn't be appropriate for our patients to do that. But with that in mind, and again, speaking to my expertise as an occupational medicine physician, physicians have one of the highest rates of suicide of any profession, more than 1 per day in the United States. Oh. And that's in context of having a physician shortage. A lot of this came over the past few decades as we've had increasing layers of administration in healthcare, which again leads to us having less control over our schedules and less control over the ways in which we can provide care for our patients. So, with some of those stresses in mind, I'll let Becky take over here.
I just want to address some of the unionization trends. You are absolutely right. There are conversations going on in our state and throughout the country. There is the Doctors Council, and they would be the ones leading the charge to unionize physicians. And then for residents and interns and fellows, they have a second sister union. And what I understand is when one happens, the other one usually comes alongside. I know in Minnesota, doctors at Mercy and other Allina organizations, two hospitals are starting to talk about that. It's important to the doctors just to learn about how to serve their patients the best. And if unionization is the way to go, that is something that they're exploring. Residents, it's a little bit different in that they are not connected with the hospitals and the clinics that they work at on a permanent basis because they're still in their training. So as Zeke said, they have quite a schedule, the 80 hours. It's really demanding. They're continuing their training. One thing that our organization offers for residents are free wellness checks, and for residents, physicians and their families, and even medical students, we offer up to 8 free counseling sessions because the rates of mental health challenges change considerably when they go from just undergrad to medical school. There's quite an increase in challenges for them. It gets even worse at residency, and when they're a practicing physician, the rates are so much higher than the general population. So our program is a peer-to-peer support, and then the counseling is with practitioners who are versed with working with medical students, residents, and physicians. So you don't have to spend your whole time talking about the demanding schedule. They already will know and will be able to service that way. And I know that nurses and other healthcare professionals have similar peer supports, but it's just so important to be healing in a space where people understand you, where they know what the demands are, and then they get that you are committed to doing the job. It isn't a job that you take lightly. Every service healthcare person really is committed to helping the patients in the community.
Is there a sense of public awareness or what the public attitude might be towards unionization initiatives in the healing arts, in doctors, physicians in particular? As you said, nurses already are, and some of the other specialties are, but physicians are not. What's the public attitude, and how does it play into the consideration?
Yeah, I might not be the best representative of this as a physician, but again, as I mentioned, I think a lot of people look at doctors and think, hey, this is somebody who makes a lot of money, who has a lot of privilege. And so, of course, you'd ask, why do we need to be unionized? But to be honest, I mean, much like in many professions where stoicism or that sort of, macho-ness is an issue, I like to think of, police and firefighting as ones where they have a lot of issues of mental health, particularly PTSD. Well, we see the same stuff in medicine. And there's a huge stigma in all these professions, even more than in the general public, to go see a counselor, to go see a therapist, to go, get a wellness check, as Becky put it. Look, in my fantasy world, everybody would go see a therapist once a month, even when they're feeling great, so that you're already plugged in when things go wrong. But of course, yet we also have a shortage in, counselors, therapists, behavioral health providers, especially for communities of color, where they're going to maybe feel more comfortable seeing somebody who looks like them. In terms of unionization, believe it or not, one big issue for physicians is these issues of non-compete clauses in our contracts. So Joe Biden brought that up early in his presidency to try to get rid of that nationally, but we're still one of the professions that suffers from that the most. And so most physicians, when they get a new job, and especially right out of residency, when you don't know how to read a contract and you're like, hey, I can finally make some money, let me sign on the dotted line here. Oh yeah, by the way, I can't practice in my local area in my specialty for, a year, 2 years, 3 years, something like that. And
after this job. Yeah.
Exactly. And you're yet another, way, or you're a hostage to the job.
Interesting. And the article that was on public radio talked about from the position of the resident. Her goal was simply to be the best physician she could be, and the stresses and the conditions really were limiting her capacity to be her very best self as a healer and as a physician. So, as you guys are talking, I'm thinking about, it's amazing that management is organized, and pharma, represents that element of the business. And why shouldn't you be better organized? And I think at the end of the day, the relationship between physicians and patients has to be the most sacred relationship, where as you support and enable individuals to be healed, to take advantage of the knowledge and training you have, right, to heal themselves, then we have an obligation to make sure that you are in a healed space as well, so that you can be your very best physician, caregiver, and that we respect that. So it's worth talking about anyway. So tell me, you mentioned the variety of things. You want to mention some of the programs you have right now at ABH that people should be aware of, and maybe people can support? Are there particular things that are initiatives you're doing right now, Becky?
Well, one thing that we are particularly excited about, for the last 10 years, we've had a partnership with Blue Cross Blue Shield Center for Prevention, and we've been on the front lines at the state, county, and local levels about commercial tobacco and limiting access and promoting healthcare. It's been a great year at the state capitol in St. Paul for public health initiatives. So we're excited that some of our long-term goals, especially on banning or limiting access to flavored commercial tobacco, is moving forward. We had a great win on the universal school foods that Governor Walz signed. There's just so many things that are happening this year, and I just want to do a shout out that there's so many great elected officials who are physicians, nurses, and other healthcare professionals that bring a perspective to these discussions that are balanced and needed and scientifically based. One thing that struck me out is when you were talking about the patient physician and patient healthcare provider connection, how important that is. We do see that throughout the country and at our state, that sometimes we do have some legislation and regulatory things that are trying to limit that. So that is another thing that we're watching closely and advocating and working in partnership with that, just to make sure that our patients have the right access to the folks who are trained that can walk through the journey with them and help them with the healing.
How do we encourage people in the community to be their own advocates more than they are? I think when I grew up, Dr. Zeke, we obviously held physicians and nurses on pedestals. They were authorities. It was God, the doctor, then us, and we had to pray to both, right? Or we couldn't question either. That's the real answer. And I think over time, we have to grow to where we understand that physicians are just like uncles and aunts, neighbors, friends, classmates, because that's what they are, people just like us, and that all of us are capable of having great intentions and great successes, and all of us can fail. And so how do we sort of change or help communities, Black community in particular, grow out of this idea that we should be silent and mute and simply listen and do as we're told? I think that characterizes some of the relationships in history, less so now. But what do you think? Am I on the right track in describing that, Dr. McKinney?
Oh yeah, you're talking about my favorite topic. I feel like you talked to all my friends and said, what should I ask Zeke about? So I'm not kidding. I mean, look, we saw after Tuskegee a lot of distrust raised in the Black community against healthcare and healthcare research, and appropriately so. But, it was also in the context of this shift from this paternalism that we had in medicine to more of, patients having to take more, what's the right word, stake in their own healthcare.
Mhm.
So to reassure everybody, let me just start from the top and say, look, the first principle of medical ethics is called patient autonomy, meaning you get to choose what's right for you. I can't tell you what to do. I don't want to tell you what to do. All I'm here to do is to be a facilitator to help increase your knowledge about what's available to you, and then you can make a choice. I could give you a whole visit and say, hey, here's how we can treat your high blood pressure, your diabetes, whatever. And at the end of the day, you could say, I don't want to do any of that. And that's totally fine. And it should be. And when physicians don't think that's fine, that's a problem for them, not for their patient. But we need to do a better job of really meeting people where they are, starting visits by asking, well, hey, what are your health goals? Okay, I'm okay taking my blood pressure medication, but I don't want to quit smoking. Oh, I'm okay quitting smoking, but I don't want to take any medication. Whatever it is. And, just let people know what that's going to come out to for them in terms of outcomes. I see in the future maybe a model where, hey, you take a nurse or a doctor and put them over at Tito Wilson's barbershop on Broadway. We can do some really basic primary care screening, blood pressure, diabetes, cholesterol stuff. And, for people who are relatively healthy, it's just informational. But then when people go to that next step of like, you know what, you really need to be plugged into a real clinic, that, sort of community clinic can help facilitate that conversation or facilitate that transfer to get people really plugged in with a doctor who might be appropriate for them. And the person's, already warmed up to that rather than having to go into a scary hospital, a scary clinic. And when I say scary, a place where it's not comfortable to you, a place where you're vulnerable and you don't know what you're getting into. And unfortunately, we haven't done a good enough job as in medicine to educate people on what do you expect when you go to the doctor? Why are they doing these tests? Why are they asking these questions? And I really think that's an area where we could do a lot, even, just in health class for younger people.
Well, there's a physician shortage, right? Am I correct with that? There's a physician shortage in the country, and I suspect that's true of nursing and therapists for sure.
Yeah.
And what would it take for us to create a conversation in community, like a public attitude, a public mind around the thought of what could be and should be versus what is? What we know exists is the shortage. And then how do we imagine solutions, strategies, processes that eliminate the shortage? In fact, invite hundreds, if not thousands, of more people into the different elements of the profession and figure out ways to make it profitable for them individually and for community. I mean, I always say that, I work with Dr. Bravada Garrett Akinsanya over at the African American Child Wellness Institute. She does a program with me every Friday on Black mental health. And her challenge is therapists, having enough therapists from our community to serve our community. The needs are great. The needs are documented. We're under tremendous trauma all the time. We come out of trauma. Our experience here emerges out of the trauma of enslavement, right? And so what if we had 5,000 therapists working in North Minneapolis, a therapist on every block, a system that tried to cultivate and show the value of connecting engagement block by block so that this was hardwired into the community? That's obviously a pipe dream, but it's a suggestion that we need to do something more to get more of us involved in our own healing, that we make it a community objective, a cultural objective, that we be present in a massive way in the healing arts, and then figure out how to do it and how to lay claim to public resources and to the market resources to make it happen. What do you think about something like that, Dr. Zeke?
Oh man, it's multifactorial. So number one, what I didn't address in part to your last question was the fact that, we have these old school sort of physicians who are like, hey, this is a tough job. I just got to go to work. I got to grind it out. And then I'm sort of in the transition zone, but then people younger than me are really more interested in, hey, I don't want a really hard job. I'd like to have a, reasonable lifestyle, spend time with my family, etc. So that's a barrier even outside of our community for anybody trying to look into like healthcare. Like, well, is that, something I really want to do? Because it's a lot of work and it's a lot of time. Now, when you think about the Black community in particular, our young folks, especially our young Black men, they have a really hard time seeing the future. And I mean, more than just a year or two away. When you tell somebody, hey, after high school, you got to go to college for 4 years, and then you got to go to medical school for 4 years, then you got to go to residency for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. some young black man's like, I'm not going to be alive that long, man. I can't do that.
Mm.
And so I think, changing that narrative to let people know, you know what, there is community support for you to do this kind of stuff. There is money out there for you to kind of do this stuff if you're willing to get out there and hustle and stay on it. And at the end of the day, we need you all out there because we're going to do better for our own community than for people who don't know what we're experiencing, who don't know about where we come from in terms of this trauma. Is it still a long road to go? Yes. Do we need to do more to push legislation and community efforts to get scholarships and pipelines out there to plug people into it? Absolutely. But I don't know, for example, you're familiar with the Ladder, Minnesota. It's a nonprofit organization put together by some of the Broadway family medicine doctors, where they meet with young folks like middle schoolers, high schoolers, about one Saturday a month to talk about issues of, healthcare and sort of to orient younger people to like, hey, this could be you. Here's examples of physicians who might be like you or from your community, and how you can go. I'm going to go this Saturday because it's about environmental health. You know what I'm about. But suffice it to say that we need more things like that so people can start to see representation and not think, it's so alien for, to see a black doctor. And thankfully it's getting better, and maybe getting my ugly mug out there enough in the last couple of years has helped a little bit. But my point is, we need to see more of this happening and not just say, oh, well, LeBron James is our only role model. And because, how many young black men think, basketball is a way out? Well, let me tell you, science, engineering, and medicine are a big way out too. You can look at me as proof.
Awesome.
I've been privileged to hear many stories that our students and other folks in healthcare, they had a really positive experience or they had a really negative experience as a patient themselves or helping a family member, and that motivated them to explore career options in healthcare and to know that they could make a difference. They could be that voice, that representation, that connection that a patient who is struggling can feel connected to. And then lastly, Al, with your questions about how to become more familiar or comfortable advocating for yourself and for your loved ones. My mom is going through some health issues, and I think there's a generational thing. She is very deferential to anyone that has authority and doesn't really question. And I have to say, especially because of my experience with this job, physicians and nurses and your whole healthcare team, they're just regular people that really want to explain things, ask questions, hear about it. So it's just the familiarity of being able to say, I don't understand. Can you explain this more? What are these options for my mom? But sometimes it is challenging not just to be deferential to somebody, especially in a white coat, that with all of the training and all of the gravitas that they have when they come into the room, that they really are there just to explain and to support you and to hear what you want for your health outcomes.
And I raised the question just to talk about how my approach to my physician should be an approach from my sense of the role I play and the ownership I have in my health. So I'm not surrendering my health to superior being or superior knowledge or even to specialized capability. I am driving my own health and my own future. And in that process, I consult, I listen to, and how do I look at the physician as a partner in my life plan versus being deferential for the sake of an image and a relationship that ultimately, may not be the very best for me in terms of agency. Well, let me ask two more questions then. This is a great conversation. Thank you both for being here, and thank you for the work that you do on the question of, the partnerships that you have to increase diversity in helping young people explore career options in medicine. Talk more about that. That's interesting, the thing you're doing this Saturday with North Broadway Clinic. Are there more things like that you all are doing to bring more people into the professions?
Well, it's a long slog to make it through medical school, to be quite honest. one thing we are working even more closely with the University of Minnesota, with the medical school and the School of Public Health. We had our first event this spring for pre-med networking. So we invited physicians and medical students and residents who are from underrepresented areas. And we paired them with pre-med students. So folks that haven't applied, they're not quite sure. Some of them are like, I have my next 20 years planned out. I know exactly what I'm going to do. And then there were other students that were like, oh, how do I become a doctor? What's the journey for that? But it was so important for them to hear about people a little farther along the journey who've made it. Some of the students were really concerned about the big loans that they're going to have to take out for medical students. So hearing what people are experiencing and how they're making that through and going through scholarships and other ways of being, and just supporting representation in all of the different fields is quite important. Zeke, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I want to go a little bit back to what Al was saying about, doctors not being on a pedestal or not being, gods or demigods, but rather being regular human beings. And that's, I think, really more the world we want to live in, where, I would encourage anybody, if you're going to see a new doctor, say, hey, you know what, forget why I'm here. Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself? So you can connect with them on a personal level and not look at them as somebody who's, lording over you and telling you what to do, but rather just a regular person who has this expertise that you sought to get from them. And to be honest, if you don't feel like you have a good connection with your doctor, you should try to find another one, and that's okay. There's no hard feeling. It is hard, yeah, to shop around, but again, we need to really talk to our young people about the fact that more and more the field of medicine, healthcare as a whole, is trying to appreciate the fact and understand that we need our physicians, our nurses, everyone involved in the care team to be a whole person. Because how can we care for other people if we can't care for ourselves and be whole people ourselves too? And thankfully, the world is going in that direction. So I'd like to think, the future doctors have a better road than me, and I probably have it better than people 20 years ago. But we still have more work to do. But hey, Al, I mean, the point for our organization, Advocates for Better Health, is when somebody like you talks to us, says, "Gee, I hear what they're saying, but man, there is a barrier here, and we need to do more for our kids. Hey, tell us what we need to do." Because as Becky pointed out, white saviorism or privileged saviorism is a thing. And having people like me who are privileged and maybe I'm not, on the street anymore hearing what people are saying, I don't know what people need. That's why you got to tell us. But, I want those messages from the community to drive what we do with our voices, with our money, with our power, with our privilege to drive these community efforts forward.
That's
I've been
awesome.
inspired by our fellows. We have 35 this year, and again, they're the medical students, and they're interested in learning how to be better advocates. But like Zeke, but even more, I'm a little distant from that age group, and just seeing how comfortable they are identifying issues, bringing them up, working in the systems, and if the systems can't accommodate or won't accommodate, they know how to make those changes. And that's what inspires me the most, that those types of students are coming through and they're changing education. They're going to be changing the residency programs. They're going to be doctors that really understand and advocate for their patients. This is just an amazing time to be part of medicine. And it's very hard for them too, because there's some things that are risking their career trajectory by making complaints if they're not treated well, if they're harassed, if anything like that. It really could jeopardize them, and they still do it. And that's why things are changing.
Let me shift a little bit here. Becky, who's the artist over your left shoulder there?
Oh, that's got to be Tacumba, right?
Looks like Tacumba. Looks like Tacumba. Is it?
It is. I had the opportunity when I was working on the east side of St. Paul. We did a paint pavement project, and President Jimmy Carter came for the day. It was a Habitat for Humanity huge project, and yep, that is him. And that art is from the Powderhorn Art Fair.
Okay, amazing. Well, Tacumba's work always stands out wherever it is. You have some too? There we go. I have a companion piece to that, either a companion piece to that or one that I've used like that. I was going to ask you about your environment there, Dr. Zeke. You a musician, obviously. You
Well, I mean, maybe a basement DJ at best. No, but I mean, during COVID, when we were spending so much time at our desk, I do play these instruments. I'm not very good, but
Mhm.
I wanted to have things close at hand. So then, it reminded me to take a break. And then I found out after the fact it turned out to be a really good Zoom or remote meeting background, and people like that, so that helps too. But no, I've always been passionate about music, and honestly, I think it's one way to stop digging so hard in on the science and use a different part of my brain. That's
Mhm.
helpful. But trust me, you ain't gonna see me in those shows anytime soon.
Well, listen. Uh, any events coming up? Oh, one more question. Governor Waltz, you mentioned this earlier, Becky. Governor Waltz signed the free school meals in Minnesota, and you know, uh, you all worked to support that, correct?
We did.
Talk
We
talk
were
about
in
that.
coalition.
Hmm.
Um, it was there was so much data that came from the pandemic time to show the actual impacts of reducing hunger, reducing that insecurity of not knowing where your food is, and then the performance of students and the impact of parents who are scrambling to find the food. And it was so disappointing that with the changes and the coming out of the pandemic, that states and the national government are considering and taking that away. So, in coalition with so many different amazing partners in our state, we were there. We helped with that, and you cannot learn if you have an empty belly. It is scary for the parents. Before I came to Advocates for Better Health, I was at a community-based organization, and we switched right away during the pandemic to do food distribution, and we were outside in December with the snow coming down. But we knew that was the number one thing that we could do to support our community. So I'm just so pleased how organized the state was, how the legislators understood that, and kind of disappointed with some of the opposition comments. Like there was just um, it was just upsetting sometimes.
Sure, certainly. Listen, we're out of time. This has been a great conversation, but let's plan to come back and talk more. I've enjoyed this conversation. I love the personal side and tying that to the mission, the work of the organization, and to your work as professionals. Becky Timm, Dr. Zeke McKinney, thank you both so very much. I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time. Take care.